I never thought a single day could unravel my entire world, but that day arrived dressed in black, standing at the edge of my mother's coffin. The air was thick with the scent of lilac and whispered condolences, yet all I could hear was my sister's cruel laughter echoing in my head. She looked at me mocking, sneering at the modest dress I had chosen, and made it clear she thought I was nothing, unworthy, invisible. Everyone else nodded politely, too afraid to intervene, or perhaps too blind to see the venom behind her words. What she didn't know, what no one did, was that I wasn't the person she thought I was. I had spent the last decade building something no one believed I could, a fashion empire now worth billions. And as her laughter cut through the hushed mourners, a single thought settled in my mind like a cold, precise blade. She would regret this. Every whispered insult, every smirk, every subtle humiliation would return to her tenfold dot by the time this story ends. She and everyone who underestimated me will wish they had never crossed me. Growing up, our house was the picture of a perfect family on the outside, but behind the polished windows, it was a cage of expectations, favoritism, and whispered resentments. My parents were pillars in our community, respected, admired, seemingly unshakable, but their love was measured and conditional. My sister, Lila, was their golden child, flawless, charming, and effortlessly obedient. Every achievement of hers was celebrated with fanfare. While my own accomplishments were either ignored or belittled, I was the quiet one, always studying, always planning, always trying to prove myself. But no matter how much I excelled, no matter how many awards I brought home or opportunities I earned, it was never enough. My parents preferred to compare me to Lila, reminding me in subtle, cutting ways that I would never live up to her. "You're ambitious, sure," my father would say, "but some things require grace, something you'll never understand." Their words were not cruel in the moment, just a slow drip of water carving out insecurity in my soul. Family gatherings were worse. Cousins and in-laws would watch, silently judging, as Lila glided through conversations, dressed impeccably, smiling perfectly, while I faded into the background. I learned to laugh at their jokes, to nod at their opinions, but inside a storm was brewing. The first sparks of resentment appeared over trivial matters, her insistence on claiming the family heirloom, arguments over property my parents hinted I would never inherit, even something as small as seating arrangements at dinners. Every slight, every dismissive glance added layers of quiet rage. Yet, it wasn't just Lila or my parents who created tension. The unspoken rules of our society, our neighborhood, our friends, our extended family demanded appearances over truth. Everyone had their role, their part in the family theater, and I had been cast as the invisible one, the one meant to admire and envy from afar. Even my own achievements were reframed as luck or coincidence, while Lila's were proof of inherent superiority. At holidays, I could see it in the way people leaned in toward her, complimented her, and then barely acknowledged me. The subtle cruelty was what hurt most. It wasn't loud arguments or dramatic fights, it was the little things, whispers behind closed doors, selective praise, favoritism, and inheritance conversations, and the way my parents' eyes would soften for her but remain distant for me. I began to notice patterns, my ideas dismissed, my successes minimized, my efforts ignored. Each slight seemed innocent on its own, but together they formed a map of exclusion, a blueprint of bias that made me feel small, powerless, an overlooked dot, and yet I couldn't leave. Cultural expectations, the weight of family loyalty, and the unspoken rules of our community kept me chained. I stayed polite, stayed obedient, smiled when I wanted to scream, and endured every judgment and every comparison. The storm inside me grew quietly, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the day when silence would no longer be enough. because deep down, I knew the day would come when all the favoritism, all the disrespect, all the subtle betrayals would need a reckoning, and I was already beginning to plan how it would unfold. It started innocently enough, or at least I tried to convince myself of that. Lila approached me with what seemed like an olive branch, offering to help me manage some family investments. She framed it as sisterly concern. "You've been so focused on your little projects," she said, her voice saccharine. "Let me help you get organized. You don't want to mess up what mom and dad left you." I hesitated, but a part of me wanted her approval, wanted to believe she could be on my side. I handed over the documents, trusting her with something I had worked so hard to secure, thinking this might finally ease the tension between us. Within weeks, I noticed irregularities. Funds were missing, investments had been redirected, and valuable family assets vanished. When I confronted her, Lila's smile was icy. "What are you talking about?" she asked, feigning innocence. "Maybe you should have paid more attention. You've always been scatterbrained. I'm just helping where you fail." Her words cut deeper than any outright insult ever could. Every late night I had spent researching, every calculation, every careful decision, it had been stolen from me, dismissed as incompetence. My parents refused to intervene. When I went to them pleading for fairness, my father shook his head. "I'm disappointed in you for not trusting your sister," he said quietly, almost accusingly. My mother's eyes avoided mine. "Family isn't about proving who's right," she said, voice trembling. "Sometimes it's better to step back. Step back." They were standing on the sidelines while my own blood bled me dry. The betrayal was total. My sister had undermined me, and my parents had abandoned me. Humiliation followed quickly. Lila made sure the entire extended family knew I had mishandled the inheritance, spreading false stories of my recklessness. At family gatherings, whispers accompanied me like shadows. Old friends and distant relatives, people I had trusted, suddenly treated me as if I were naive, incompetent, unworthy. "Poor thing," they murmured, always trying to keep up with Lila. Every glance, every sideways comment, became a reminder that I had been outmaneuvered, publicly shamed, and abandoned by the very people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. One night, I locked myself in my old bedroom, the place I had once considered a sanctuary. I held the papers in my hands, the evidence of everything she had done, and I broke down completely. Tears blurred the lines of anger and grief. I shouted at the walls, at the empty room, at the ceiling, wishing someone, anyone, would see the injustice, would recognize that I had been wronged. I felt my world collapse in layers: trust, family, pride, all shattered by one calculated betrayal. And then something inside me shifted. The pain, the shame, the humiliation, they were no longer just wounds. They became fuel. A quiet, cold resolve settled over me, sharper and heavier than any grief. I would not cry endlessly, nor would I plead with people who had already made their judgment. Lila had underestimated me, assumed that I would bow quietly to her manipulation, assumed that I would accept the narrative she had spun. I looked at her smug face in my mind, replaying the moments she laughed at me, the way she had orchestrated every lie, every financial maneuver, every subtle cut to my dignity. And I vowed silently and utterly that she would pay. Not in words, not in tears, but in a way that would leave her reeling, exposed, and powerless, just as she had left me. The storm was no longer inside me. It was waiting, building, calculating. Every late night of planning, every moment of silent observation, every memory of her betrayal became a brick in the foundation of what I would do next. And as I finally rose from the floor, the tears dried, but the rage remained. I whispered to myself, "This isn't over." Not by a long shot. The first step was patience. I had spent years being underestimated, dismissed, and laughed at. Now, patience became my weapon. I couldn't rush. Every move had to be precise, every detail considered. I started by quietly reclaiming control over my own life, building resources and alliances in ways no one could detect. Business contacts I had nurtured over the years became silent supporters, unaware of the larger, darker purpose I was assembling. I transformed my grief and humiliation into focus, planning a revenge that was not impulsive but inevitable. I began with small, almost invisible strikes. Lila's social standing became my first target. I carefully leaked stories to her circle, framing her as reckless with family money, planting doubts that grew like a shadow over her reputation. She laughed when she first heard whispers, confident that her charm would shield her, but the seed had been planted. Friends who once leaned on her for advice began hesitating. Business associates subtly distanced themselves. Each small victory gave me a taste of the satisfaction I had imagined for years. Simultaneously, I started reshaping the narrative of our family history, highlighting patterns of favoritism and manipulation that Lila and my parents had ignored. Publicly, it was subtle, comments at community events, seemingly casual mentions to acquaintances, anything that suggested a story of inequality and deception without directly implicating me. It was like watching a slow-motion avalanche. The cracks formed invisibly, but they were undeniable. Financially, I made careful moves that would later have devastating consequences for her. Investments she had diverted from me were being quietly traced, leveraged, and redirected into ventures that would expose her recklessness. Each step was deliberate. One misstep could ruin everything. There were moments of anxiety, small setbacks when my plans almost slipped an associate who questioned my intentions, a financial document that temporarily vanished, a friend who nearly revealed too much. Each time I corrected the course, tightening the strings, ensuring the plan could not fail. Meanwhile, I cultivated a personal transformation that no one could ignore. I built my fashion empire quietly, acquiring brands and influence, creating a name that demanded respect. Every public appearance, every interview, every contract became another thread in the tapestry of my eventual triumph. Lila, still laughing at what she believed were my trivial pursuits, could not yet see the storm gathering on the horizon. Subtle, almost imperceptible supernatural undertones crept into my strategy, not in a literal sense, but in the psychological weight I carried. I imagined her waking at night, heart pounding, feeling a presence she couldn't name, an invisible force that seemed to watch and measure every misstep. In quiet moments, I allowed myself the satisfaction of imagining her paranoia growing, her confidence eroding, her carefully constructed world cracking from within. The universe itself, I believed, had begun to conspire on my behalf. I had meticulously mapped out the day of the final confrontation in my mind. It would be public, yet poetic, humiliating, yet just, inevitable, yet shocking. Everything depended on timing, precision, and the perfect reveal. I tested pieces of the plan in small social circles, gauging reactions, refining my approach. Every smile she gave, every casual remark, every false sense of security she exuded, it became a tool I would use. Yet, I allowed myself brief moments of doubt. Could I truly dismantle someone I once loved, someone I shared a childhood with, without losing myself? Each hesitation only strengthened my resolve. I realized the truth. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity, proving my worth to the world, and demonstrating that betrayal would never go unpunished. The final steps of preparation were almost ritualistic. I reviewed every financial document, every whispered accusation, every public slight she had ever directed at me. I knew the climax would require perfection, timing, optics, and psychological impact had to align. I allowed myself to smile quietly in the privacy of my office, imagining her expression when the full weight of her hubris came crashing down. And then came the night. I knew it would all converge. I stood alone, reviewing my plan one last time. Each small victory, the growing doubt, the financial vulnerabilities, the cracks in her reputation was now aligned for the moment of revelation. I could feel it like electricity in the air, a tension that made my pulse race. The revenge was no longer a distant dream. It was imminent, inevitable, and deliciously precise. The storm I had carried silently for years was about to break. Lila's laughter, once so mocking, would meet the silence of her undoing. My parents' dismissive glances would meet the sharp sting of consequences. And as I closed my eyes, visualizing the moment, I allowed myself the chilling certainty this plan, crafted from betrayal, patience, and quiet genius, would leave no room for her to escape, no path to redemption. The pieces were in place. The stage was set. The audience, unwitting and unaware, would soon witness the downfall that had been brewing in shadows for years. And in that moment, the culmination of years of pain, anger, and meticulous preparation would unfold exactly as I had imagined, leaving no doubt that I had been underestimated at my own peril. The funeral had been the starting gun. The reveal would be the finish line. One chose a public forum. Lila prized a gala where she was to accept a philanthropy award, an evening of cameras and donors. She arrived in sequins and certainty, a queen in a room that still adored her. I walked in like a shadow, unassuming, dressed so no one looked twice. That was the point. The first cut was financial and surgical. As she took the stage, the screens behind her flickered not with the expected slideshow, but with evidence, contracts, bank transfers, emails she had thought private. I narrated, calm and precise, each line of deception as numbers and dates unspooled. Gasps rippled. Her smile faltered. Cameras zoomed. Handlers scrambled. Sponsors began receiving calls. Donors learned funds she'd touted for charity had been siphoned into shell companies. Board members, whose reputations depended on prudence, stepped away. Partners rescinded endorsements. Applause turned to whispers, then to pointed questions. Her curated world tilted. Public humiliation met legal consequence. A compliance officer, tipped beforehand, stood and demanded transparency. Murmurs hardened into formal accusations. Her name, once synonymous with grace, was read with transfers and dubious invoices beside it. Reporters swarmed. Live feeds cut between her flailing explanations and evidence that refused to obey her. Narrative: I had arranged financial pressure to hit when her liquidity was weakest. Banks froze accounts. Lawyers filed emergency injunctions. Statements from regulators landed like thunder. Creditors emerged. Assets she thought secure were swallowed by legal maelstroms. She watched as attendants removed plaques and donations were suspended. Her empire, woven from charm and manipulation, unraveled. There was a quieter cruelty. I made personal betrayals public, messages she'd sent, cruel comments about our family, calls where she laughed at my hardship. The recordings played beneath the flurry of legal documents, a soundtrack of contempt. My father's eyes darted away on camera. My mother's face remained unreadable. Their social circle recoiled. By the climax, the room was a study in collapse. Lila stood alone on a stage that had cheered her, now empty save for echoes. She was not physically harmed, but she was exposed, stripped, and bankrupt in reputation and funds. I felt vindication, but it was colder and more complicated than I had dreamed. Neighbors who once praised her crossed the street. Childhood friends texted condolences to me instead. Her laughter was replaced by a stunned, hollow silence. Everywhere else. By midnight, headlines declared the fall. By dawn, accountants and lawyers were still counting losses. The supernatural I'd teased manifested only in how fate turned with clinical precision, as if the universe itself conspired. In the hush after the chaos, I understood the revenge had succeeded meticulous, merciless, and irreversible. The days after the gala were quiet, almost surreal. Lila retreated from the public eye, her social media accounts abandoned, her business contacts severed. Family gatherings ceased. My parents avoided my calls, their silence heavy with guilt and disbelief. The empire I had quietly built now stood unchallenged, my name spoken with respect and awe, while hers became a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and neighborhood streets alike. Yet, victory was not a celebration. There was an emptiness in seeing someone I once loved crumble, a hollowness that no fortune or reputation could fill. Revenge had been satisfying, yes, but it had also left a lingering shadow, a reminder that betrayal leaves marks. And the price of justice can weigh heavily on the soul that delivers it. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine her reflection in the mirror, a face haunted not by supernatural forces, but by the meticulous consequences of her own choices. The thought chills me still, that the world can be both fair and cruel, and that those who underestimate others often pay dearly. And now I ask you, the listener, as the echoes of this story fade into silence, what would you have done in this situation? Would you seek justice or let the betrayal pass and live with the weight forever?